Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast, made for women who want their healthiest years to be ahead of them, not behind them. Join your host, Courtney Townley, right now as she breaks down the fairy tale health story you have been chasing all of your life into sensible action steps and lasting change. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast. This is your host, Courtney Townley. As always, thank you so much for being here. I know there's a lot of places you could be, so the fact that you're here with me, it always means a lot. And I hope you get a lot of value from the show today. Now, we're in the throes of summer here in the US. I know that's not the case for everybody, especially those of you living in Australia, right? The other side of the world. I know that you're going into your winter. But summer is here in the US, and it's an interesting summer for sure, because I would normally have my son, who is 10 years old, in summer camps. That's kind of what we've done historically over the last many, many years, because my husband and I both work full time. We are both self-employed, which, on a side note, I would never recommend to a household to have two self-employed people. It's hard. But we somehow make it work. And we both are crazy happy with the work that we do. But my point is that I have a 10-year-old son home for the summer because there are a few camps available, but largely camps have been canceled. And even the ones that are available, I just didn't feel comfortable sending my son for the summer with COVID in the world. So he is home while we are working, which is fascinating, right? Like it's definitely got its challenges. I will not deny that. But it's so awesome to witness my son entertaining himself during the day. I mean, kids are so good at enjoying life in really healthy ways. Now, I realize that kids can also enjoy life in unhealthy ways, right? They can get really into the video games and the computers and the TV screens and the sugar, all of those things. But kids are remarkable at engaging with their adventurous side, their creative side, their playful side. And there's something really to be learned from that as adults, because as adults, we've kind of lost our way largely from those qualities. It's not that we don't have them, it's that we're just out of practice with them. And this is precisely what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about, yes, happiness and joy, but I really want to talk about the act of seeking pleasure in healthy ways. Because let's face it, there's a lot of unhealthy ways that we can seek pleasure. And I would argue that most of society does seek pleasure in a lot of unhealthy ways. So specifically, I want to talk about understanding the different types of pleasure, why it's so important that we choose wisely if we really are concerned about our health or we really do want to optimize our health, and why the right kinds of pleasure are so beneficial to our health and happiness. So let's just start by identifying what pleasure actually is. Pleasure is a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. That is Google's definition, which is interesting because when I read that, I was thinking, well, hang on a second. That sounds like happiness, right? So what is the difference between pleasure and happiness? So of course, I went on another Google search and I actually found a lot of articles about the difference between happiness and pleasure, which is fascinating. And I spent a lot of time there. But I found a specific article by a physician, a doctor. Her name is Margaret Paul. And she wrote an article called The Difference Between Happiness and Pleasure. And I just wanted to read you a passage from that article because I think it's food for thought. I think it's a really great thing to consider. She says this: there's a huge difference between happiness and pleasure. Pleasure is a momentary feeling that comes from something external, a good meal, our stocks going up, making love, and so on and so forth. Pleasure has to do with the positive experiences of our senses and with good things happening. Pleasurable experiences can give us momentary feelings of happiness, but this happiness does not last long because it is dependent on external events and experiences. We have to keep on having the good experiences, meaning more food, more drugs, more alcohol, more money, more sex, more things in order to feel pleasure. As a result, many people become addicted to these external experiences, needing more and more to feel a short-lived feeling of happiness. That's the end of the passage. So when I read that, what I heard loud and clear is that the way that she is defining the difference between pleasure and happiness is that pleasure is short-lived and it is created by external things, consuming external things, versus happiness, which is really more in the way she's describing it here, more internally driven and more long-term. So pleasure gives us kind of a taste of happiness, but it's very fleeting. And I think it's really important to remember that as humans, we are hardwired for the trifecta of seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and exerting the least amount of effort. And I've spoken about this in a lot of different spaces and places. This is kind of our survival brain at work. Those are its three primary objectives: seek pleasure, avoid pain, exert the least amount of effort. So really, seeking pleasure historically has kept humanity alive because it has encouraged us to procreate. It has encouraged us to forage for food, for survival, to find shelter, to do a lot of things that actually help to keep us alive. So I think it's important to remember that, yes, even though it is a survival mechanism to seek pleasure, in modern day culture, seeking pleasure can go horribly wrong. And we're going to talk about that more in just a second. But before we go there, I want to talk about the chemistry of pleasure and even happiness. Like, what is happening chemically within us that encourages us to seek pleasure and pursue happiness? So first up is we have dopamine, right? The reward center in your brain releases dopamine in response to pleasurable experiences. So in a lot of ways, dopamine is the pleasure-seeking chemical. It's the chemical of motivation. It doesn't actually make us feel pleasure like a lot of other neurotransmitters, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second, but it makes us want to seek out the things that will allow us to experience pleasure. So dopamine is the motivator when we're thinking about chemicals. Then we have oxytocin, which a lot of people refer to as the love or the cuddle hormone. This is a hormone secreted in the brain during certain activities, specifically ones associated with connection, friendship, attachment, and trust. It's kind of hyped up as the hormone that encourages feelings of attachment, of safety, of trust, and even bonding with others. So oxytocin is released in massive quantities when a mother is breastfeeding, or when you're making love, or when you're hugging, or you're connecting in any way with another human. So oxytocin makes us feel safe and loved and connected. Now, serotonin impacts more of our moods. Specifically, I would say the moods of like anxiety and depression and happiness. And I know those are kind of extremes of the spectrum, right? So depression on one end of the spectrum and happiness on the other, because really low serotonin has been linked to anxiety and depression. And high levels of serotonin really do make us feel good, right? So even you think of like mood altering drugs like ecstasy and LSD definitely cause, right, a significant rise in serotonin levels and cause people to feel euphoric. Now, I just want to say here, because I always love to insert this because I think it's so important to remember that 80% of your serotonin that makes you feel happy and good, it's produced in your gut. And I think that's important to remember because if we're not eating well, if we're not sleeping well, if our microbiome is really dysregulated, we probably aren't going to it's going to affect our moods because it's directly affecting the production of serotonin. And then we have endorphins. Endorphins are the feel-good chemicals because they act almost like a pain reliever and even a happiness booster. They help us to deal with pain and stress. Now, what's important to remember about all of these chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, is that they can all be sort of nurtured in a lot of different ways. Some of those ways are very unhealthy, and some of those ways are very healthy. So let's talk about that. So I want to talk about kind of short-term false pleasure. What the heck does that mean? So I'm specifically referring here to things outside of you that are concentrated pleasures that give you a really intense chemical reaction in the human body, specifically with the hormones the chemicals I was just talking about. So I'm talking about eating food, right? If you think about it, modern day food is very concentrated. It's very concentrated like in sugar, in preservatives, in lab-made chemistry, which definitely affects us in a powerful way. So when we eat a food that is concentrated in sugar, we feel better immediately, right? Until we don't. So I want to give you some examples of other short-term false pleasures. Drinking, alcohol, drugs, social media is like concentrated connection, right? Porn is concentrated sex. We could even say like shopping, right? Because now we have this whole online shopping opportunity that's like a concentrated, intense experience that makes us feel good temporarily. Now, why is it's so easy to engage in these short-term false pleasures? It's so easy to go out and eat or to drink alcohol at night or to go do drugs or spend endless amounts of time on social media or watch Netflix for hours on end because it's so accessible, right? And we have normalized these things largely as a culture. So these short-term false pleasures are very accessible. And they're they're easy to get our hands on and they're fairly cheap, right? For us to engage with. But I want you to remember it's intensified pleasure. So it's not honest pleasure. And I say it's not honest pleasure because we're almost manipulating nature in order to stimulate the chemistry, the feel-good chemistry in our body. And a lot of these things, eating, drinking, doing drugs, being on social media, it's instant gratification. And it doesn't take us a lot of time to engage with those things. So for all of those reasons, it's really easy to overdo those kinds of pleasures, which of course has a lot of negative consequences over time. We become addictive. So we get addicted to social media. We see our children addicted to computer screens and TV screens. We get addicted to alcohol. We get addicted to food, specifically sugar, floury foods, things that really give us a strong hit of blood sugar. And these pleasures, these intensified, what I'm calling false pleasures, they don't promote our well-being. They make us temporarily feel good in the moment. There's a lot, like I said, of that instant gratification, but there's typically a negative consequence on the other side, right? And that negative consequence can show up in a lot of different ways. Maybe you feel like hell the next day because you drank alcohol. Maybe you feel like you need even more sugar tomorrow because you ate the sugar, which of course, compounded over time, is going to lead to a lot of disrupted chemistry in the human body. Not to mention the amount of time and energy we waste in the aftermath of recovering from these kinds of things. So when we sit and watch endless hours of television, that's time that we're not spending on things that actually are meaningful to us, whether that's time with our family or putting time and energy into our passions and pursuits. We're wasting time. So there's negative consequences in a lot of different ways. I would also say one of the negative consequences is that it kind of, when we constantly engage with false pleasures, we're always eating and drinking and really looking for that intense, immediate gratification. It really numbs us from the truth of our life, right? Because we aren't spending time in the spaces and places where our time and energy would actually help us to grow our life. We're also using a lot of these false pleasures as coping mechanisms, right? Because again, instant gratification. So if I had a bad day at work, I'm just going to eat something with like that really soothing trifecta of sugar and fat and salt, because it's very soothing to my system in the moment. Or maybe I'm really stressed out about a project at work. And so rather than feeling the stress and working through the stress of work in a healthy and productive way, I just decide to drink so I don't have to feel stressed. But then drinking makes me feel crappy the next day. My chemistry is unbalanced, and then I don't really tackle the issue from a grounded place. I'm not thinking my best. I'm not problem solving in creative ways when I'm in a space of chemical disruption. So it would be really interesting for you to consider what are kind of the false pleasures that you gravitate towards, either to feel good in the moment or because you don't want to feel something else in the moment. Now, some of you might be listening to this like, okay, Courtney, well, if I don't go towards, like, I really do enjoy eating. I really do enjoy drinking alcohol. I really do enjoy watching Netflix. But it's the dosage that I'm speaking to, right? Like, we're not using these things occasionally to either feel emotion or not feel emotion, we're using these things almost daily to manage our emotional landscape, which is very dangerous. And here's the other thing, right? There's other ways. There's a lot of ways where we can promote short-term natural pleasure. So maybe that's carving out some time in your day so you can spend time alone. Maybe it's when you sit down for a meal, you really stay mindful and you eat slowly and really experience your food. Maybe you just apply mindfulness to a lot of different activities in your day, so you're fully present with what you're doing. Maybe you make time for a creative endeavor, like an art that you kind of stopped doing so many years ago and you've always wanted to pick back up. Maybe you sit down to read a book. Maybe you just carve out white space in your schedule, which is just a period of time in the day where you have absolutely no plan and you just decide what to do in the moment. These are all natural ways to also stimulate those pleasure chemicals, right? Those happiness chemicals in the body. But why don't we prefer these things? Why don't we make time for these things? Well, lots of reasons. Number one, they typically require more time and attention, right? It's easier for me to eat something than it is for me to sit down and work on an art project. It's easier for me to have alcohol than it is for me to figure out how I'm going to create white space in my calendar for tomorrow. So it's not as efficient for your brain to reach for short-term natural pleasures. And I would also say this, I think short-term natural pleasures, like the ones I just spoke to, they're really a practice, right? It's something that a lot of us have been so out of the practice of that it just requires more time and attention to get back into them. And there's an element of discomfort, right? If you're someone who never creates time in your schedule to be alone or to do things just for the sake of enjoyment, like experiences like reading a book, taking a bath, going for a long walk in nature, it's going to feel very uncomfortable for you initially to carve out that time and space and to do that activity. But once you start receiving the benefit on the other side of those things, you probably will, number one, be motivated to keep doing them. But also, you might find that you're not so often reaching for those false pleasures, right? When you create more white space in your schedule, when you create more time for your artwork, when you're more mindful about the things that you're doing each day in your life, maybe you don't need to drink as much because you're actually creating genuine fulfillment. Maybe you find that you're not in the kitchen as often as you would be if you weren't doing those things. So I would really encourage you to consider, how could I replace some of the false pleasures in my life, right? Again, the eating, the drinking, the social media scrolling, the shopping, with things that actually bring me true pleasure naturally. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to be comfortable. But there's not a negative consequence to the natural pleasures. If you go for a walk in nature today, you're actually going to be benefited by that choice tomorrow. You're actually contributing to your well-being. But if you use that time instead to scroll social media, you're probably going to be maybe just a little bit zoned out. Maybe you're going to feel remorse or regret later in the day from the time you wasted. There's definitely going to be a negative consequence to that. Taking time to meet up with a friend and play a game of tennis is going to bring you that natural pleasure and have a benefit on the other side, right? Again, you're nurturing all those chemicals in a very natural way. But if you decide instead to meet up with your friend at a bar and just drink, yes, you're getting the connection with your friend, which is a natural pleasure, but then you're also combining it with the false pleasure of drinking alcohol. And so there is going to be a negative consequence from that. So I'm telling you all of this just to get your brain working and just kind of considering how might you want to realign some of your choices to make sure you're getting tons of benefit and very few negative consequences. Okay, so let's talk about things that help us to develop long-term pleasure, right? And I would say, when I say long-term pleasure, I'm probably alluding to what Dr. Margaret Paul, the quote that I read at the beginning of this episode today, was speaking to in terms of happiness, right? Pleasure that we can kind of sustain, pleasure that really gives us a long-term benefit, is really what she speaks to as happiness. And things that help us to develop that are things like learning, right? Getting educated about something new, developing new skills, having a new experience, having a new adventure, making some kind of big positive change in our life. Maybe that's a new job. Maybe it's a new relationship. Long-term pleasure also comes from accomplishments, working hard over long periods of time to achieve something or become a more kind of resilient and robust version of yourself. It comes from creating new possibility in your life. Long-term pleasure comes from working hard at things. Like, again, maybe that's schooling, maybe it's a job, maybe it's relationships, right? And definitely, I'm a big fan of reaping a lot of pleasure from self-development. So I've always been a fan of self-development. Obviously, it's the world I have chosen to work in as my career field. But I personally just have a very strong interest in self-development, because as I am willing to look at the spaces and places of my life that aren't really serving me, and I go to work on changing behavior in those areas, it definitely brings me a lot of pleasure to lean into behavior change and to practice behavior change and become a better version of myself. So the things that lead to kind of that long-term pleasure or happiness is, it's because of who you become in the pursuit of them. So when I pursue a new skill, when I take on, a really big behavior change and I'm really committed to working through that, when I'm in relationships for the long haul and I work on myself, I almost use relationships, right, as a tool of personal development. I feel more confident. I feel stronger. I feel more resilient. And ultimately, I just feel a lot of pleasure about my life, and I feel really happy. And yes, those are outside things, right? Education is learning about outside things. Accomplishments are, you could look at them as external things. But they require delaying gratification, right? And that's a big difference between those intense, short-term false pleasures. Those are immediate gratification. We feel great in the moment, and then there's a lot of fallout in the aftermath. Where the pursuit of kind of that longer-term pleasure comes from being okay with not feeling great in the moment. In fact, leaning into discomfort and hardship in the pursuit of accomplishing something. And understanding that the gratification and the satisfaction comes later, but it's so much bigger and it's so much more sustainable. So I want to give you some ideas about how you can engage in more of the natural short-term pleasures and more of the long-term pleasures to promote your well-being. So these are things that you pursue to feel good, to keep that, chemistry, that feel-good chemistry robust in your body, but it doesn't have a negative consequence, right? So some ideas are, first and foremost, make a list of things that actually allow you to feel natural pleasure. And the things that make me feel natural pleasure might be really different from you. You're somebody who may love to practice the violin, and that just brings you so much joy. But for me, it might look like sitting down on a Sunday afternoon and reading a book for 2 hours. So what are the things that help you to feel good? What are the things that motivate you in a healthy way to promote pleasure? And here's the next thing is be willing to experiment. I say this on almost every podcast. Because what works for you right now to create natural pleasure might be really different 6 months from now. And you got to stay really honest with yourself about why you're doing anything, right? Am I doing something because it's bringing me natural pleasure and it's promoting all this great chemistry in my body and it's almost a form of nutrition? Or am I doing it because I'm trying to avoid something else? Only you are going to know the answer to that. Make a plan for how you're going to make time for natural pleasures. Because the truth is, like I said earlier, your brain is hardwired for the immediate gratification and stuff that is really concentrated in terms of pleasure. So it's not going to feel natural or easy for you to choose more natural pleasures, right? So again, eating the cake is going to feel easier than making time to read the book. Having another glass of wine or having a glass of wine is going to feel a lot easier than, calling up your girlfriend to go take a 30-minute walk. And this is why I say you need a plan, because if you don't have a plan for how you're going to incorporate natural pleasures into your life to promote well-being, you won't do it. Because you'll just keep reacting to life. And your reaction is built on what your current practice is, which for most people is reaching for false pleasure. The other thing I want to say is engaging with natural pleasure and things that really serve your well-being is not the standard quo. So it's really normal to feel a little bit isolated or like you're going upstream against, where everybody else is headed. And so there's a lot of work there to manage your thinking and to allow yourself to feel some difficult emotion. Because you will feel kind of like a pioneer. I run into this a lot with my clients who are trying to eat better or drink less. It all sounds great. They know why they're motivated to improve. But one of their biggest hangups is that they feel like they can't socialize. They can't go out with their friends to the bar on Friday night. They can't eat out at all the restaurants they used to eat out at least not initially, right? Because they have to build traction. And that can be tough. That can be really tough. So just remember, it is not the standard quo to seek natural pleasure. The standard quo in our culture is to seek a whole lot of false pleasure. The other thing I want to say is drop the guilt and drop the people-pleasing. I know a lot of women feel guilty when they carve out time for themselves to be alone or to travel by themselves or to, go get a massage or, take that hour at lunch to go exercise. And I just want to remind you that the guilt is coming from the way you're thinking about the thing, right? You're thinking about other people judging you. You're thinking about all the other things you should be spending time on. And that's why you're feeling guilty. And here's the truth. If you feel guilty, about pursuing natural pleasure, you're actually going to feel worse. And then it's probably going to lead to more eating and drinking and social media scrolling and all of the things. So you got to drop the guilt. You have to manage your thinking so you don't have guilt. And then the people pleasing, ladies, right? The people pleasing gets in the way of a lot of things. Well, if I take a couple hours for myself on Sunday afternoon, my husband's not going to like it, right? We tell ourselves stories about how everybody else is going to respond to our choices. And here's the thing you want to remember about people pleasing. People pleasing is, in most cases, inauthentic living. Because what you're doing is you're actually compromising what is important to you to make somebody else happy. And then we convince ourselves that that's actually a good thing. But it's not a good thing because you're basically lying. You're telling somebody you'll do something even though you don't want to do it. So it's not authentic. And that's really something to consider. So if you know that you need more time and space in your life to engage with things that allow you to really experience pleasure and contribute to your well-being, people-pleasing is not going to help you to do that. Because if you're focused on people-pleasing, you're going to compromise all of your time and energy to make other people happy. And just in closing today, I want to say this. Really consider what false pleasure is costing you, right? To pursue the things that really radically affect your chemistry in the immediate moment. Consider what it's costing you. It's not allowing you to truly experience life, right? Because a lot of times it's numbing the reality of our life. So it's changing our emotional landscape so dramatically, it's not allowing us to be honest with what's truly going on in our life. False pleasures also cost us a lot of self-trust because we say we want one thing. We say that we want to feel healthy and vibrant and have self-leadership in terms of our life. But then we're constantly reaching for things pleasure-wise that are completely misaligned with that desire. And that causes us to not trust ourselves. And like I said earlier, false pleasures are also going to cost you a whole lot of time and energy. Because not only do they cost a little bit of time and energy to engage with initially, but the aftermath of having your chemistry jacked up from sugar, alcohol, zoning out in front of TVs all day, the overspending, the over whatever. You have to spend a lot of time and energy cleaning that up. And that sucks. So don't kid yourself that it's not coming at a high price to engage in that immediate gratification. So the final question that I really want you to just kind of cling to and ask yourself a lot over the course of the next week, the next month, maybe the rest of your life, is the pleasure that I'm engaging with in my day, in my week, is it nourishing my well-being or is it depleting it? I can't answer that for you. But it's a really great question to ask yourself to get very honest with yourself about why you're doing what you're doing. And even though it feels good in the moment, be honest with yourself about what's happening after the moment. What happens in the aftermath? And if there's a big consequence for you to pay, I would argue that it's depleting your well-being. All right, my friends, I hope this was helpful. I hope it just kind of gets you thinking about maybe pleasure in a different way. I'm really so fascinated by the conversation specifically with women around pleasure, around joy, around happiness. Because, I find two things. Number one, women are very we kind of restrict the amount of happiness we allow into our life. And this is a pattern I've seen with clients and my own life throughout, many, many years. And it's fascinating that we do that. It's like we block happiness, or we only allow it in for a period of time before we push it back out. And then I think we also try to make up for that by reaching for a lot of false pleasures and kid ourselves that we're actually feeling true happiness, which we're not, for all the reasons I talked about in this episode today. So this is a conversation that I've had on this podcast before. I did a whole episode. I can't tell you specifically which one it is in terms of the episode number, but it was called Allowing Happiness. I did a whole month on joy. So we've had this conversation many times, but pleasure is something that I think we haven't really covered before, and we did today, which is awesome. And on this note, I just want to tell you that in the next episode of the podcast, I am bringing in a sex coach who specializes in helping married women enjoy sex more with their husbands. Because when I think about pleasure and I think about nurturing relationships, specifically with a spouse, this is a conversation that, maybe not surprisingly, it comes up a lot. And I've actually had several requests over the past couple of years to bring in relationship experts, to bring in people who can talk about the challenges that women face in their sex life. And it's a conversation I've always wanted to have on the podcast, but finding, the right vibe and the right person to kind of have that conversation with has been a little bit more of a challenge. So anyway, I think it's going to be really fun, and I'm excited for you to join me for that conversation as well. So that'll be on the next episode of the podcast, episode 208. But in the meantime, apply what we talked about today. Ask yourself those questions. And I would also just ask you to please, if you enjoy the podcast, if you love it, if you want to see it flourish and grow, please leave us a review. Reviews are a great way for us to get into the ears of more and more listeners. A lot of people read reviews when they are considering listening to a new podcast. And so taking 2 minutes of your day to head on over to iTunes, rate and review the podcast would do me a world of favor. So thank you in advance for considering doing that. And better yet, actually doing it. All right, my friends, go off, have a wonderful day. Consider the things that we talked about today, and let's see what comes out of it for you. All right, we'll talk soon. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Grace and Grit podcast. It is time to mend the fabric of the female health story. And it starts with you taking radical responsibility for your own self-care. You are worth the effort. And with a little grace and grit, anything is possible.